Ready for a deep dive into a fascinating period of history? We're tackling the Spanish conquest of America today, but not the version you might remember from those dry textbooks.
Right.
We're dissecting this article from Geneseo in Espanol called Rethinking the Spanish Conquest of America. And trust me, it'll make you rethink a few things.
It is remarkable how this article really makes us question assumptions we might have about this era. It's not about rewriting history, no, it's about understanding it with more nuance,
Yeah.
greater depth and accuracy.
Absolutely. And one of the things that jumped out at me was this idea that the conquest, it wasn't a simple case of like European domination.
Yeah.
The article drops this bombshell statistic from historian Esteban Miracabayos. Get this. It claims that a stunning 95%
Wow.
of conquistadors were indigenous themselves. 95%. That's not just a footnote. That's practically the whole story.
Right.
Expert, how does just this one fact, this number, how does it reshape how we see the conquest?
Well, it throws a real wrench into the traditional narrative.
Yeah.
If most of the conquistadors were indigenous, it reframes the whole idea of a conquest, doesn't it?
Totally.
It becomes less about, these two totally separate civilizations clashing and more about internal power struggles, right, within the Americas themselves.
Yeah.
The article even suggests that allying with the Spanish, for many indigenous groups, it was a strategic move, a way to sort of advance their own agendas, maybe against rival groups that they already had.
It's like this whole web of alliances and rivalries was already in motion, and then the Spanish arrive, and it's like pouring gasoline on a fire. And speaking of alliances, the article highlights how they weren't just about military might. Right. These partnerships were about navigating the complex world of pre-existing power struggles, right, between all these different indigenous groups. Expert, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Any particular examples that come to mind?
Absolutely. Think about the Tlaxcalans. They were a powerful indigenous group who decided to ally with Cortés and the Spanish against their rivals, their long-standing rivals, the Aztecs.
Wow.
This alliance was really important in the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital.
Right.
But it's super important to understand that this wasn't some simple case of just siding with whoever was stronger. The Tlaxcalans, they had their own motivations, their own goals,
Right.
including, resentment towards Aztec rule,
Yeah.
a desire for their own autonomy.
So it's much more layered than just like, the Spanish showing up and taking over. To really get this period, we have to really understand these existing power structures, these alliances, rivalries, the strategic calculations at play, and how different indigenous groups used even the arrival of the Spanish to their advantage.
Exactly.
This leads us to another fascinating point the article makes: the legal rights of indigenous people under Spanish rule.
It's definitely something people often overlook. The article really emphasizes this point. Queen Isabel I of Castile, she established laws that actually granted indigenous people in Spanish territories, they had the same rights and responsibilities as Spanish citizens.
Now, that's not something you usually hear when you're talking about colonial powers.
You're telling me.
Right.
And while the article does say, of course, the reality on the ground wasn't always pretty, the very fact that these laws existed, it really sets Spanish colonialism apart, at least a little, from other European powers at the time. It suggests a different approach, at least on paper, to the whole idea of the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized.
Yeah, it begs the question. What was the intention? Was it genuine? Trying to integrate people? Was it like a PR move? Or was it something in between? This just goes to show history is rarely black and white, right?
Totally. And to make it even more complicated, the article points to another really unique thing about Spanish colonialism: their big focus on building cities and institutions.
Interesting.
Unlike some other European powers, who were just happy with coastal outposts,
Yeah.
the Spanish went all in, building cities, universities. They were putting down roots.
Wow, they established the first universities in the Americas. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really does seem like they had a much more deliberate, long-term vision than other colonial powers, right? What do you think? What was the driving force behind that approach? And how did it shape maybe the long-term consequences of what happened during the conquest?
It's a complicated question.
Right.
I mean, on the one hand, building all this stuff, cities, universities, it served a really practical purpose.
Right.
It solidified their control, made administration easier, helped spread Spanish culture, language, religion.
So it wasn't just about like extracting resources. It was about investing in a way in infrastructure, institutions.
Exactly.
Wow.
But we also have to think about the other side of that coin, the impact it had on the indigenous populations.
Right.
It led to displacement. It led to new social hierarchies, the suppression of their own knowledge systems and beliefs. It's a classic example of how even actions that seem positive can have these unintended negative consequences.
Right. That's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. It's about peeling back the layers, right, of this seemingly simple event and revealing all the complexity underneath.
Yeah.
And speaking of layers, let's talk about Moctezuma II, the Aztec emperor. The article has this really interesting story, this anecdote about his descendants.
Oh, yeah, what a story.
Yeah.
Just imagine a history professor in modern times
Yeah.
and a descendant of Moctezuma, who is now a Spanish duke, having dinner together in Spain discussing the conquest.
Wow.
It sounds like something out of a movie, honestly.
Yeah.
But it really highlights something amazing about this whole period.
Yeah.
History isn't just in textbooks. It's alive and well in the lineages and stories that are passed down generation after generation.
It really shows how history isn't just about dates and names in a book, right? It's about people and their families and these legacies that echo even today.
For sure.
Shifting gears a little bit, there's this other point in the article that I thought was really interesting. Spain, they didn't even think of their American territories as colonies. They called them provinces, not colonies.
Interesting.
Help us unpack that a bit. What's the significance of that distinction? Was it just like a word, or was there something more substantial behind it?
I think it's a really important difference. It tells us a lot about how Spain saw their whole, role in the Americas.
Okay.
By calling these places provinces, they were making a statement about how they were going to run things, their administration.
Right.
These weren't just random places scattered around the world in their mind. They're supposed to be like integral parts of the Spanish Empire.
So they saw them as extensions of Spain itself, not separate.
Exactly. And it wasn't just talk either. This had real implications. It meant that, in theory, these provinces were governed by Spanish law. They were entitled to certain rights and protections.
Right, but like we were saying earlier, even with laws in place, the reality of how those laws were followed could be a completely different story.
Oh, absolutely. And that kind of leads us to another really important point the article makes. The whole idea of the Black Legend.
Ah, yes, that campaign to make Spain look bad.
Right, exactly. And the article acknowledges the terrible things the Spanish did, of course.
Right.
But it argues that this Black Legend, it often blew things out of proportion.
Okay.
While also, downplaying or ignoring similar things that other European powers were doing at the time.
Interesting.
So to really understand how complicated history is, we need to be critical of these different narratives, these competing stories.
Right. It's not about denying Spain's role in the violence, the exploitation, but it's about understanding it in context and recognizing that people told similar stories about other colonial powers, too.
Exactly.
This brings us to maybe the most interesting part of our deep dive today. The impact of DNA, modern DNA studies, on how we view the conquest and its legacy. This is where it gets really, really fascinating.
For sure.
The article highlights how these DNA studies challenge a lot of the traditional narratives in some pretty major ways.
It's really incredible what science can do, how it can change your view of the past.
I know, right?
For example, the article points out that most people in Spain today, they're actually descended from the Visigoths, that's a Germanic group, predates the conquest.
Wow.
So this idea that the Spanish conquest totally replaced indigenous people with Europeans just isn't true.
Clearly not. Instead, we see this fascinating mix, right? This mix of ancestry is across both Spain and Latin America, and it tells a much more complicated story.
Absolutely. And if you want to see the genetic legacy of the conquest, look at Latin America.
Okay.
The article says that most Latin Americans today have a mixed ancestry, indigenous American, European, and often African as well.
It's like you can trace history through people's DNA.
Right. It reminds us that the past isn't some distant event. It's part of who we are.
It makes you realize that the categories we use to define people, they're way more fluid and complex than we realize. We've been talking about the European and indigenous sides of things, but there's another piece we can't forget, especially because of that African ancestry present in many Latin American populations. And that's, of course, the transatlantic slave trade. A horrible chapter in history, and it's completely intertwined with the Spanish conquest.
Absolutely. We can't talk about the effects of the conquest without talking about slavery.
Right.
The forced movement of millions of Africans to the Americas obviously had a huge impact on the demographics, the culture, and yes, the genetics of the region. It's a sobering reminder that even as we discover these connections and challenge old stories, we have to remember the darkest parts of the past too.
This whole deep dive is really reminding me that history is full of contradictions. We see these moments of great intellectual and cultural growth, but alongside terrible cruelty and oppression.
That's it. You have to see both sides. To understand the past, you have to acknowledge the progress, the tragedies, all the complexity.
We've covered a lot today, from who the conquistadors really were, to the laws of Spanish colonialism, the Black legend, and now even DNA. It feels like this article is making us rethink almost everything we thought we knew about the Spanish conquest.
And it shows how much more there is to uncover, to learn. History's not static, it's a conversation, always evolving as we discover new things, new ways of looking at the past.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Exactly. It's like this huge puddle, and we're putting the pieces together, one by one.
As we kind of wrap up our deep dive here, what are some of the key takeaways about the Spanish conquest? What should our listener keep in mind going forward?
I think the biggest takeaway is the Spanish conquest, it wasn't just this one event. It was a process. It went on for centuries. And it had these huge consequences.
Right.
It's a story about cultures mixing, people adapting, new identities being formed, and also, incredible resilience, people facing unbelievable challenges. And it's a story about the lasting effects of colonialism and of resistance.
It's a story that continues to shape the world today in so many ways.
For sure. And I think when we're dealing with all the complexities of today's world, really understanding the past in all its nuance becomes even more important.
This deep dive, it really makes you think. It reminds you that history isn't just something back there, it's still alive today.
Absolutely. It's up to us to ask questions, to really challenge what we think we know and to bring those hidden stories to light.
So any final thoughts for our listeners? Anything they should keep in mind as they keep learning about this time period?
Well, remember what we said earlier. History's not usually black and white. There are a lot of gray areas, contradictions, different ways of seeing things. This article gave us a really good way to rethink the conquest, to see it in a new light. But we should also be asking, whose voices are we missing?
That's a great point.
Right, whose perspectives might not be fully represented here.
Yeah. What can we learn from those stories that haven't always been told, right? In the textbooks, the mainstream narratives, all that.
Exactly. Think about all the knowledge we could gain from indigenous oral histories, from their art, their traditions, their cultural practices. By engaging with those sources, we can start to build a more complete understanding of what happened. One that acknowledges the complexities, the contradictions, the legacies of the conquest from multiple points of view.
It's a reminder that history isn't just what's written down. It's a living thing, made up of millions of individual stories, experiences. It's our job to find those stories, to listen with open minds, and to honor just how resilient and rich human history really is.
Well said. What a great deep dive this has been.
I couldn't agree more. It's amazing how much one article can make you think. A huge thank you to you, expert, for helping us understand all of this.
My pleasure, as always.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep those questions coming, keep exploring history, because it's anything but boring. See you next time.